Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue the journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKoyen Khan Olav Shalom, and it is in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz. We began chapter 4 and went through the first part of that section in Perek Daled, which the theme of this chapter you can call is levushim, the garments. So in Perek Beis we talked about the very identity of the soul. Chelik elekam emal mamash. In Perek Gimel we talked about the faculties, the koiches hanefesh alekis, the faculties of the soul, namely moichin and midas, the cognitive and the emotional faculties of the divine soul, so they're completely consumed with the divine experience, contemplating on the divine, and emotionally connecting a relationship with the divine through ava and yira, love and reverence. Perek Daled is the levushim of the divine soul. The levushim of the divine soul is the actualization and the expression of those faculties that are driven by the very identity of the soul. Because it is only through thought, speech, and action, those three garments, that we can express ourselves. Whether it's our ideas, the mind, that expresses itself through thought, when you learn Torah, or when we speak and explain all the divrei Torah that we learn, or other mitzvahs hatluyos b'dibur, mitzvahs that are connected to speech, through speech, and then the ultimate bulk of mitzvahs, maisius, actions. So thought, speech, and action are the garments, the channels that express. And here we're talking about the divine soul, so they express the divine. It's the garments in the language of the Alter Rebbe, right in the beginning of the chapter, Perek Daled, chapter 4, he says, Shehe machshava dibra maisa, yesh l'chol nefesh alikish shleish levushim, shehe machshava dibra maisa. Every divine soul has three garments. They are the thought, speech, and action. Shel taryag mitzvahs ha-Torah. Because of the 613 mitzvahs of Torah, through which one expresses, through speech, thought, and action, I should say through thought, speech, and action, all these taryag mitzvahs, as we elaborated upon in detail, as he explains how each one of the garments addresses another part of Torah mitzvahs. Okay. We also learned how ava v'yira are critical in this whole process. The mind expressing, the thought expressing the mind of learning Torah is clear. How about how dibur and maisa, speech and action, express love and awe, or love and reverence? And the answer to that is because you cannot perform the mitzvahs properly in a full, sustainable way unless it's driven by ava and yira, as we understood and explained. So that explains how the levushim are now part of the whole process, are part of the expression of the divine soul. But now the Alter Rebbe is going to add something, a tremendous chidush. Now you would think garments, in contrast to faculties of chapter 3, garments in chapter 4, garments are removable, are exchangeable. So they would be lower than the faculties. The faculties of the divine soul are the actual faculties, so-called the evrei hanefesh, as he said, taryag evrei nafshe, the 613 components, like the limbs and organs of a human body. Can you compare the garments, like a jacket or a shirt or other garments you wear, which are not part of the very essence of the human body? And yet the Alter Rebbe says, and this is the chiddush, that because these garments are manifesting and expressing Torah mitzvahs, they are much greater even than the faculties of the neshama. That's what we began learning. So what's the Lashon? Here's the language of the Alter Rebbe. V'hinei shleisha levushim elu. These three garments we just described, so now we said that they express. Now he says that hinei shleisha levushim elu ma'ateiru mitzvei seho. Now these three garments, when they're devoted and they're dedicated and they're expressing Torah and its commandments, af shenikroim levushim, even though they're called garments, lenefesh ruach and neshama, even though they're called garments, which seems to be a garment, is not as powerful. It's more of an external expression than the actual faculties. Nevertheless, im kol zeh, gova v'godla ma'ilosam le'en case v'sof, al ma'ilus nefesh ruach and neshama atzma. Nevertheless, they are infinitely greater and level and quality, he says, both gova v'godla, than the actual nefesh, ruach, and neshama of the actual soul. And the answer is, how do you explain that? Because it's not the garments alone. The garments are completely seamless and transparent channels of Torah mitzvahs. So essentially, the Torah mitzvahs gives the garment something that the neshama itself doesn't have. So how does the Alter Rebbe explain it? So he says, as it's written in the Zohar, as the Zohar writes, the Reis of Kutchebrichu, Kulachad, Torah and God, Kulachad, are completely one, are totally one. Pirush, Alter Rebbe explains, Pirush, what does this mean? It means that Raisa, that Torah, Hi Chachmose v'Retzeinei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now we're getting the essential translation of what Torah really means. Or better than translation, the very essence of the level of Torah is Chachmose v'Retzeinei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The wisdom and will of God. V'HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvei ba'atzmei kul echad. And the Eibishter, in his essence and his glory, is one with the Torah, or the Torah is one with him. So that's the types of the Zohar. The Zohar says, a Raisa v'kutchebrichu kul achad, a Raisa, which is the Rotzen and Chochma of the Eibishter, or Chochma and Rotzen of the Eibishter, in the order that the Alter Rebbe says it, the wisdom and Rotzen of the Eibishter, and the Eibishter, b'kvedi ba'atzmei, they are all one. Now this is a big statement. To say something is one with God, is a big statement. We're not just saying God created it, like all of creation. We're saying more than, not even like a neshama, which is a chelik elikam imal mamish. It's kul echad. And the Alter Rebbe explains why. How could you say that? Ki hu hayedeya v'hu hamada. Because in the language of the Rambam, kameshkosav le'il b'shem Rambam. What does the Rambam say? Because he, the Eibishter, is one, the knower, with the power to know and the known. The three expressions. The Alter Rebbe uses two here because that negated the details. So basically, since his God is one, the knower, which is God is one with what he knows, and the Torah is what he knows, so they're all one. Like we said earlier in chapter 2 from the Rambam, which only amplifies the question. There he also said the neshama is one, and he also brought this expression that the neshama comes from Chachmase v'Retzeinei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Allah b'machshavtei, like a child that comes from the very essence of the seed of the Father. And he also brought Hu Hamad Hu Yedei, that Chachma is one with Eibishter. So now here he's using this to explain that Torah is higher than the Neshama. And the answer, in simple Asius, in simple words, is this. There is an expression, Yisrael Araisa v'Kutchebrichu Kul Achad. Yet, the fact is in Zohar, the expression there is Miskashron da b'da. Torah, Araisa v'Kutchebrichu are bound one with another. Kesher is like two things that are bound together. Chad, mamish chad, is seamless unity. So though they're all connected to the Eibishter, Yisrael, Reis, V'Kudsha Brichu, Kula Chad, but the chad of the neshama is different than the chad of Torah, the unity of the neshama. Why? Because the neshama is not meant to remain a piece of godliness. It's meant to come into this world. In the language later used in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chof and other places, Yotzu v'nifradu, the neshamas are meant to separate. They retain their divine personality. But look, let's go back to chapter 2. It's a child. It's a son of God. As much as the son is connected to the very essence of his father, he's a separate entity. When a child is born, he becomes a separate entity. Torah never becomes separate. You can say Torah is like the limbs and organs, kavyachol, so to speak, of God. So as much as a child is connected to his parent, as much as neshamas come as a chelik elekam mimal mamish, at the end of the day, their role is to be ambassadors of the very essence of the divine to transform this world. The Torah is meant to be the tool that they use to connect. So in Giluyim, essentially, the Achdus of Torah with the Eibishter is deeper. That's why we say, Eisi atam leichim. Anon nafshi ksovis yehovis. Anoichi is an acronym. I have infused my very soul in the Torah. Eisi atam leichim. Vayichuli. You take me when you learn Torah. If a neshama is chelik elikal malmamish, you already have God. You're a piece of that godliness. But the neshama is now in a separate state. So neshama, with Torah, you have the best of both. That's one point. Another point, as he said back in chapter 2, chelik elikam mimal mamish. He never said it's chadim elikam mamish. Chelik. Why? Because it is a chelik. That this chelik elikam mimal mamish ve'yipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, the Eibishter infused the human being with nishmas chaim, with ve'yipach, metechi yusei, mepnimi yusei. So it's taka coming from machshavte, from chachmosei, and he's one with his chachma, but it's neshama as it emerges from chachma. In order to enter and go through the world, like we say every morning, neshama shenasata bi, teherihi, ata barasa, ata yitzarta, v'ata nefachta bi, v'ata meshamra b'kirbi. So you see that the neshama is going through gradations, through a journey. The Torah we're going to learn also goes through a journey, but it never loses its unity with godliness. The neshama also doesn't lose its unity, but in a revealed way, the neshama is a neshama beguf. You never say the Torah is a Torah beguf, so to speak. Because the Torah is a Reisa V'Kudsha Brichu Kula Chad, total utter unity. So in fact, you really need both. The neshama alone is taka divine. Even when it comes down to the lowest levels, like we learned in chapter 2, that when the neshama, even akfayim, which is like the heel, and even Peish Yisrael, all retain their divine connection to Chachmos Yishal Kadosh Baruch Hu, but not in a revealed way. It needs to be revealed. Even in chapter 2, he already hinted by said the Dveikus, Ledovka, that when you attach yourself to Al Talmud Chacham, that's how you draw that energy. Why do you need to attach if you're a chelik elikam mimal mamish? Because you need to bring it alive. So the neshama is like a child. A child can also, Rahman al-Islam, be estranged from a parent. But he's still a child. Torah can never be estranged from Elikuz. That's why it's not makabel tumah. It doesn't accept any impurities. And when you walk into a Sefer Torah walks into a room, you rise. Why don't you rise for every every Jew? And the Sham is a chelik elikam mamamas. Why don't you rise? Because that chelik elikah, sham yotzu v'nifredu, is the language he uses in Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chof, whereas the Torah was not yotzu v'nifredu, it didn't separate. In different words, we can put it this way. We learned in Perek Beis that the Esses Sfiris, especially in the Hagah there, the Esses Sfiris are one. Iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'garmu echad. They're the 10 attributes of the divine. They're like part of godliness. Obviously, God is higher than the faculties and attributes. But hu v'chachma echad. So the neshama is derived from there. That's why it's connected. But the neshama is not a sphira. The Esser Spheres is the place where the neshamas emerge from. And their faculties will be nishtalshel mehem, will evolve from the 10 spheres. Torah is like the spheres themselves. Torah is the Chachma of the Eibishter and always remains Chachma Sheish Baruch. The neshama travels through Chachma Sheish Baruch from the highest levels, even higher than Chachma, because Chachma is one with the divine that's even higher than the attributes. But it then emerges, in a sense you could say it separates. When I say separate, I mean like a branch of a tree. And it goes into ultimately, that it ultimately enters into a body. Torah remains the limbs and organs of godliness. So we don't say that a neshama is an extension, a limb of the Father. You say it has the etzem of the Father, but it became a separate child. So Torah is necessary. And in this context, Torah mitzvahs through levushim, because the levushim are expressing Torah mitzvahs. What do you do? What happens when a neshama does Torah mitzvahs through its thought, speech, and action? It reaches this mile that's gova v'godla malosam lein kates on the nefesh ruach neshama, because it has that achdus, that the revealed unity, that then reveals that you are the child of God, that you are one with God. And that's what he says here. And interesting there, in Perek Beis, he didn't bring Yisrael v'kudshe brichel kol echad. There he brought that it's like vayipach ba'apav, and he spoke about machshavte v'chachmosei yisbarach, that it originates in God's thought and mind, and that it's one with God, hu v'chachmosei echad. All b'machshava. So yes, it originates in chelik elokah, but clearly here he introduces the word chad, that unity. The Araisa, which is Hi Chachmas Shen Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, VaKodesh Baruch Hu, B'Kvei De Ba'atzmei, Kul Echad, which also explains why he adds B'Kvei De Ba'atzmei, because he wants to show that it's connected to the very essence and of godliness. So he uses the words B'Kvei De Ba'atzmei. And explaining how can you say this statement, that the wisdom and will of God, which you can say is a level. The Spheres, at the end of the day, Chochmah, or even Rotzen, Keser, are still Spheres. So how do you say it? Because Ki Hu HaYedei V'Hu Amada. There's that unity. Which brings us back to the Haggadah in chapter 2, where he said, Kol HaYedei Hu Amada, Hu HaYedei V'Hu Amada, he said was in Atzilus, that the Skimuloi Chachmei HaKabbalah, that we're talking about how it manifests in the Spheres. And the Lashon of and the Arizal, Yitziva Milsei says, with Arizal, when you're talking about the idea of not higher than Atzilus, he said. Because the fact is, as Torah comes down in Chachmas Ritzeinei, it is coming into the shape of Chachma. When we learn Torah, we learn the wisdom of God. By a neshama, the neshama is a chelik elikam mal mamas, but you can't say you look at a neshama and you see God's so-called faculty or attribute called chachma or rotzen. So it is a level of chachma and rotzen, so something to hold on to, but that's one chadhu im kved v'atzmei with a kodesh baruch Hu. So there we see how this Esofa of Torah now, that comes through thought, speech, and action is higher, much higher and greater, infinitely, than the neshama itself, for this reason. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this a lot more as we continue on, but I just wanted to emphasize again, in the Haggadah, in Perek Beis, he said, Hoide lechachme Kabbalah, k'mesh kosav ha'pardes, v'gam lefi Kabbalah Sarizal, he says, that Ein Sof is merumam umisnasa remus ein ketz l'mayla mayla m'muhus b'chinas Chabad. So there too, that level is that level, because b'seidir shlapsha seid Ein Sof baruch ha'idei tzimtzum miram became the Chabad d'Atzilus. But there he was talking about the neshama. But he's bringing Hu Amada HaYudei here. That's why I'm referring to that. So you have to say the Hu Amada Hu Yedei in the neshama was to emphasize that the neshama remains and retains that connection. And here we're saying that it actually retains that it's united. So a neshama is a child that is one with its father, but the Torah is the father himself. So the neshamas, even the highest level of neshamas, you remember he said, is the ben. The moyach haben is Reish Alfi Yisrael, the Gedeli Yisrael, the Talmidei Chachamim. But I want to repeat again, now it makes sense what it says. Why do you have to connect the Talmidei Chachamim? Because you need to connect the Chachmasi Yisbarach. And where is that? In Talmidei Chachamim, who bring Torah. He didn't emphasize Torah and Yisrael there, and the Shamas, but now when you understand in chapter 4, he brings now Torah Beis comes alive, now you understand what a neshama is. We learned about the faculties of the neshama, the levushim, and now the mile of the levushim, because they manifest and they express the very essence of the Father himself, in this case. His limbs, his organs, his faculties. Obviously, that's not the etzem, but the etzem is one, hu amado yedeya, with his faculties. Okay. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to go deeper, which is also very similar, reminiscent of what he said in Perek Beis. He's going to ask, "Va'avda Kadosh Baruch Hu nikra ein sof l'gedulose ein cheker." So now, the fact of the matter, you're saying the Eibishter, you're one with the Eibishter. The truth is, why the Eibishter is higher and completely removed from anything. The Torah is, yes, Kutchebrichu Raisa v'Kutchebrichu Kul Echad. But how could you say that when the Eibishter is completely Ein Sof L'Gedose Ein Cheker? Means he's without end. The Torah has parameters. L'Gedose Ein Cheker, and his greatness can never be fathomed, says in Tehillim, Kuf Mem Hei Gimel 145:3. V'les machshava tfisa beklal, and no thought can grasp him at all, as it says in Tikkun Zeyar. V'chein b'ritzeni v'chachmosei, in addition and more than that, not just he, but also ritzeni v'chachmosei, which was referred before to being Torah, also kediksiv ein cheker l'tvunosei. And similarly, his will and his wisdom are also described as non-graspable. His understanding, no one can fathom. So not just he, nobody can fathom. His understanding also nobody can fathom. And he brings yet another pasuk. Uksiv hacheker alika timtza. It's written, can you through searching find God? In other words, no search can really find God. This is in Iyuv. The first pasuk, Cheker alika timtza, is Yeshaya Mem Chav Ches 40:28. And this verse that I just read is Iyuv, Job 11:7, Yud Aleph Zayin. And one more pasuk. V'ksiv kilei machshavei seichem. And is written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. That's Yeshaya Nun Heches 55:8. So both the Eibishter himself is beyond our capacity to contain and understand, and his understanding is beyond, we cannot fathom. He brings all these levels because he's trying to say to me that machshava, chochmeh, ritzene, you're able to somewhat connect to. Because that's the whole chiddush of Torah and mitzvahs through the garments that the neshama doesn't have. But the fact is the Torah too is beyond, and beyond. But in other words, even with Torah, we have no capacity to fathom and relate to God. So why are you saying that now we have suddenly a higher level of connection of the levushim? So now the Alter Rebbe is going to come and answer that question, which is going to explain in a fascinating way what really is Torah. Because right now you could say, okay, Torah is one with the Eibishter, meaning the Torah is nothing but an expression of God's wisdom and God's will. That's Torah mitzvahs, God's wisdom and God's will, as opposed to, let's say, you learn a book, lahavdil, a science book, or other wisdom. That's not chachmosei shel yisbarach. It's understanding God's mind, but through human effort, through human search. Torah is God's chachmah. He put his wisdom in Torah. So it's one. But the truth is the Eibishter is beyond it all. So how do you explain the beyond of godliness within the parameters through Torah? And remember, Torah has to remain one. And neshama, you can say, neshama taka becomes a separate consciousness, like a child, separate consciousness from the divine. But we want now that the neshama should experience the oneness that comes through the three garments that manifest and express the Torah mitzvahs. So how do you reconcile and explain those two aspects here? And especially when you take into consideration that Torah is about details, things that relate to time and space, and halachas, that are specific details. As soon as you talk about details, the Eibishter is beyond all details, beyond any aspect, any dimensions. He transcends all limitation, completely infinite. And yet we're saying Torah manifests and is one, and God invests his whole being, like he said, is one with the Torah. So that's going to be the next section that we're going to learn. One more point I want to make and go back a moment is when he said that Ki hu yidei v'hu amada. So you can ask a question, 1 second, hu yidei hu amada. He said clearly in the Haggadah that that's referring to Atzilus, lefi the Torah of the Arizal. Because there is a Torah in Atzilus. And that is Ba'achdus, but there's also Torah as it's rooted all the way higher than the Tzimtzum and higher and higher. So I just wanted to clarify that point that he mentioned earlier. And with this, we'll stop this year now, and we'll continue next week. Everyone have a good tavach. Go to TanyaApply.com, where you can find this year and all previous year, and you can also post any questions that you like. Kol Tuv. Afreilich Chodesh Kislev.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.